News and conversation, definitely some music thrown in occasionally here on Saturday afternoons, and we are delighted to be with you on a Celtic Sojourn where we explore traditional and contemporary music from around the Celtic world. We often delve into other aspects of items of interest from that part of the world. And this afternoon we are being visited here by James Smith, who is member of the English department over at Boston College. Jim, great to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
Now, you were here because you and I got together and started talking about something that is very, very prominent at the moment in the social fabric of Ireland, something that has really come up, and that's the issue of mother-child homes, Magdalene laundries, various other aspects of Irish life, very dark aspects of Irish life that have come to light suddenly and overwhelmingly over the last 20 or 30 years. Back in 2008, you wrote a book called Ireland's Magdalene Laundries and the Nation's Architecture of Containment. There is a conference coming up on Thursday. Just give us the background of what I'm talking about there writ large, Jim. If somebody didn't know anything about this and came across you, how would you give them the summary of what this is all about?
Well, thanks, Brian. I'd first of all perhaps say that it took for me, leaving Sligo, where I'm from, and coming to Boston, to first ever hear the term Magdalene laundry. So I went through my college education in Ireland not knowing that such places existed. And you're exactly right. I think we might point to some time in the 1990s as marking the moment when stories about parts of Irish society that we preferred not to know or we chose not to speak about began to emerge. And in large part, I think, thanks to very, very brave individuals who came out and spoke and provided testimony about experiences growing up in an industrial school, or a woman who gave up a child or felt that a child had been taken from her in a mother and baby home, a woman who was in a Magdalene laundry, and then also adoptees or adopted persons increasingly asking questions about why they don't have access to information about their early life. In Ireland, you still don't have access to a birth certificate if you're adopted. And I think obviously the more people spoke about it and campaigned for justice, we've had now 15, 20 years of first of all, the Bertie Ahern apology to survivors of the industrial schools, the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse, the Residential Institutions Redress Board, the McAleese Committee investigating state involvement with the laundries, Enda Kenny's very powerful apology.
So yeah, just hold for a second. So you're going through a litany of socio-political reactions to what went on, but this was a very, very at the deepest level. This was a human tragedy of extraordinary proportions that shocked so many people in Ireland that it existed to begin with, and around the world, people who look back. Ireland has such a diaspora. Look back at Ireland with horror to think that this was going on even as they were either growing up there or their parents were growing up there. So the impact can hardly be overstated.
No, but at the same time, Brian, there's very few towns in Ireland that didn't have an industrial school. Mm-hmm. Magdalene laundries were not, as I often say, they weren't in some former estate up a dark alley or up a long driveway. Magdalene laundries were commercial for-profit businesses which relied on people being able to bring their laundry to them. So they were in towns, and the larger towns in Ireland. They might have been secret to a certain extent, but that secret was pretty open. We chose not to know that these places existed, and we certainly looked the other way to ask, and rather than ask questions about who was doing the work there or what was happening to these children in these homes. The state was convenienced by the fact at one level that the religious orders were there to do this work for them, and then the state failed in its fiduciary responsibility and in its duty of care to these vulnerable citizens, mostly young women and their children.
How much of this was due to the special position of the church within the government of Ireland, even at local level?
Well, I'd say that's certainly very much part of the story. I think it's too easy to singly just point out the Catholic Church. As I said, many of these services in other democracies and other jurisdictions would have been provided by the state. And I think it's very important to remember that. But coming out of our experience with empire in the 1920s, the Catholic Church was very quick to formalize relationships with with the state, to insist that they would be paid for services they provided. And they actually were very slow to allow inspection, regulation. Many of these institutions became absolute institutions. And the Catholic Church obviously assumed a position of dominance enshrined in the Constitution in 1937 until it was repealed in the early 1970s.
So this was going on and being ignored, being covered up quietly, and people were accepting of it. But then Ireland started to change, probably in the mid-1980s, and that change started to accelerate, driven by circumstances and scandals. And then when the lid was blown off of that, Jim, something else happened. It just seemed to kind of come seeping up out of the ground, literally in some cases, as in the case of the Tuam horrors.
Yeah, and certainly an endpoint or perhaps the high point would have been Tuam. But you mentioned in the late 1980s, that's when the first memoirs started to appear. So I think about Patrick Tuher's memoir of growing up in Artane, Fear of the Collar.
And Artane was an famous industrial school for boys, in fact. Right. And they had a wonderful front. They had the Artane Boys Band.
Still do.
People of my age growing up would have known them to always be a big part of the celebration at Croke Park for All-Ireland finals. But behind the scenes, Artane was a very dark place.
A very dark place. The Ryan report, which was in the report published as a result of the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse, said that in boys' institutions, this was published in 2009, sexual abuse was endemic, not occasional. It was endemic. And Artane was at the very centre of that. Artane was the largest industrial school in Ireland or in England.
So to move on from that, the impact on Ireland was dramatic, obviously. But your area of interest in this came with what you call transitional justice. Sure. How do you address this in a society where it seems to be embedded in the very fabric of the culture, and the collaborative efforts by the state, the police authorities, and the church to maintain a system of abuse at this scale? How do you redress that?
So transitional justice is something that I think listeners would probably know. In a nutshell, we could think about what happened in South Africa after their apartheid regime fell, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in many, it's something we associate when there is dramatic political regime change. Then in the more recent years, just in the last 5, 7, 10 years, countries like Canada and Australia, so settled democracies, began to use transitional justice to address abuses in institutions, especially childcare institutions. However, or wherever it's applied, Brian, transitional justice is interesting because it comprises these 4 elements: accountability, reparation, truth-telling, which is the piece that I probably am most invested in, and then the final one is a guarantee of non-recurrence. And that notion, the idea of a transitional justice approach, was brought to the context of Irish institutional abuses by Minister Catherine Zappone in March last year, when
member of the government
who did her PhD at Boston College. But Catherine Zappone announced in March 2017 that scientific evidence now confirmed that there are significant human remains at the site of the former baby home in Tuam, and those baby remains, those children's remains, are from the mid-20th century. There was an idea that they could have been famine dead because the institution in question was a former poorhouse in the 19th century. And just this past week, last Monday, Minister Zappone announced that the government have decided to do a full exhumation, forensic investigation, analysis, individualization, and where possible, and then dignified reburial, memorialization. So the full, everything that many families were asking for at the individual level of these children who were lost. Some 796 children, it's believed.
It's phenomenal. It's just it's hard to even absorb. But as you said, absorbing it, dealing with it, bringing it out in the open, truth, if not reconciliation right off the bat, but certainly truth, and then some compensation as well. As you said, a guarantee of non-recurrence, but compensation. And one of the areas that you were involved in, they did something happened in Ireland where they talked about compensation, and they went on a worldwide search looking for victims of Magdalene laundries, right?
Well, I suppose the government did more advertising for survivors in the diaspora with the industrial and reformatory schools. They were very slow, in fact, Brian, to bring the existence of a redress scheme specifically for survivors of the Magdalene laundries here to the United States. And we knew there were women here in America who had experienced these institutions in Ireland. In fact, one of those women called me in my office at Boston College 10 years ago this month after my book had come out. And that really was what that brought me from being an academic around these issues. I'm still an academic, but to become an activist and engage in advocacy. And that woman ultimately did benefit when there was an apology and then there was a redress package put together. She got a lump sum, but more importantly, she got some health care and she got an old age pension, which really transformed her existence here in the States.
So talk about that for just a moment. If anybody is listening out there this afternoon to this discussion, and if they know of somebody or have a relative that they feel should be involved in this scheme, what would they do next?
Yeah. I would immediately call the Office of the Consul General here in Boston. The Consul General kindly and very actively lobbied to ensure that an advertisement appear. It was in the Boston Irish Reporter and the Boston Herald just in August in 2018, some 5 years plus after the apology and after the scheme was introduced. But that was the first advertisement in North America. And I know that the consul is open to receiving calls. Then it's a very straightforward process. The scheme is still available, still open. You're put in touch with the Department of Justice. Once they establish your duration of stay, how long you stayed in one of these institutions and which particular institution, you should be eligible for lump sum compensation, old age pension, healthcare benefits, and some other benefits as well.
We're talking with James Smith. He is Associate Professor of the English Department at Boston College. You also run a very interesting lecture series there, Jim.
Thank you. The Lowell Lecture Series.
The Lowell Lecture Series, which is open to the public, by the way, a really phenomenal resource. Check that out. But I want to talk just a little bit before we end about the conferences coming up on Thursday. Tell us a little bit about that.
The conference is Thursday and Friday. It's entitled Toward Transitional Justice, Recognition, Truth-Telling and Institutional Abuse in Ireland. It kicks off at 1 o'clock on Monday with Ireland's Minister for Children, Catherine Zappone. And then there's a series of panels about the Canadian and Australian examples of these institutions. But all day Friday, there's a whole series of panels about regulating shame in Ireland, about imagining and the role of imaginative literature.
Regulating shame in Ireland. What an interesting term.
Yes. A panel of 4 legal scholars, as it happens, Brian. The second panel is about those working in the arts, because I think the arts help us imagine these stories. There was a wonderful example of that last night at the Irish Cultural Centre in Canton, which aired the Mother and Baby documentary, which features Peter Mulryan. And I think it's documentaries and creative literature, poetry. We have a poet, a memoirist on the panel of survivors at 12 o'clock on Friday. I think that's going to be a highlight of the conference. Four survivors, all of whom have written about their experiences. There's a panel on Irish adoption in the afternoon. There's also a panel addressing artefacts. What are the traces of this history? Because many of these buildings have been demolished, have been sold into private enterprise and development. And I think it's very important that we don't forget in the present, even as this population of survivors are getting elderly, it's very important, I think, that we connect the past and the present and we learn those lessons so as to ensure that there is no recurrence in the present or in the future.
Recognition, Truth-Telling and Industrial Abuse in Ireland Towards Transitional Justice. That goes on at BC coming up on this Thursday. And you can find out more about that just by simply searching that. Simple search with Boston College and Transitional Justice will bring you to the right source. You can also, of course, send me an email if I can be of assistance in providing any more information. But again, to any of you out there listening who know somebody who knows somebody that may have been affected by this in generations gone by and in decades gone by, please contact the the office of the Irish Consulate here in Boston for further information how to connect. It's such an important issue. Jim, thanks so much for coming into us this afternoon and giving some background to this.
Thank you for having me. And again, I'd also be available at BC if I can ever be of assistance or can help anybody.
Again, a general email address would be me to begin with, because I can connect you further. That's Celtic with a C at WGBH.org. Celtic with a C at WGBH.org. We're going to finish up here this segment of A Celtic Sojourn with a piece actually famously sung by Christy Moore with Sinead O'Connor, something that actually, talking about events that changed us, Jim, and I'll keep you in this for just a second, things like the Kerry babies, things like the Pope's visit, things like the bishop scandals and the priest scandals, that changed
the moving
Ireland.
Statues.
The moving statues, which are from my area, right around Ballinasspittle and when you're right between Kinsale. All of those things changed us. But this particular one, tragically, Annie Lovett in what county was it? I'm trying to think.
Granard County, Westmeath.
Westmeath. And the background to that is that she was found dead, having given birth
at the Grotto of the Virgin Mary, at the back of her local parish church.
And a very haunting song written by Nigel Ralph as a result of it, sung here by Christy Moore with Sinead O'Connor. It takes us out of this rather tough segment of A Celtic Sojourn, but an important one, as you said, as Transitional Justice tries to do its work. That's Boston College, Transitional Justice. Again, Jim Smith, thanks for coming by.